Breaking news. President Trump has announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran and promised that within 24 hours the war will officially end. He's also described it as the 12-day war, which I'm sure the Israelis like the sound of. Supposedly Qatar was the intermediary, and Iran and Israel have agreed to it as well. This is great news. They're giving diplomacy another chance and minimizing the harm to civilians. However, I do have two concerns. Firstly, I'm not sure how the US managed to accomplish its goals in such a short period of time. It will be really interesting to see how these negotiations play out and what deals come out of them. It could be that this advanced negotiation tactic doesn't accomplish anything at all, and Iran just stalls and rebuilds. The second concern is whether Israel and Iran are really on board with this. From the Israeli perspective, they're winning, and they might not get another opportunity like this. From the Iranian perspective, failing to attack one airbase is not a fair trade for destroying their nuclear sites. Unless all sides are motivated to remain at peace, then we could see this war flare up again. We've also got a bit more information on Iran's nuclear capabilities since yesterday. Marco Rubio said they had enough enriched uranium for 9 to 10 nuclear weapons. However, I didn't see anywhere that the Trump admin said they had proof that Iran was making them. Instead, it seems like Marco Rubio was using the balance of probabilities or circumstantial evidence. This has a very long history in international relations, so I'm not going to criticize it. Even though people that are familiar with Iraq and other similar claims probably have reason to do so.
It doesn't matter if the order was given. They have everything they need to build nuclear weapons. Why would you bury things in a mountain, 300 feet under the ground?
Right.
Why would you bury why do they have 60% enriched uranium? You don't need 60% enriched uranium. The only countries in the world that have uranium at 60% are countries that have nuclear weapons. Because it can quickly make it 90. They have all the elements. They have. Why do they have a space program? Is Iran going to go to the moon? No, they're trying to build an ICBM.
No, but
so
that's
they can one day put a warhead on it.
That's a question of intent, and you know, in the intelligence assessment that it was that Iran wanted to be a threshold state and use this leverage. I'm talking about the public March assessment, and that's why I was asking you if you know something more from March.
But that's also an
inaccurate
inaccurate representation of it. That's an accurate representation of it. That's not how intelligence is read. That's not how intelligence is used. Here's what the whole world knows.
Simply asking if we had intelligence that there was an order to weaponize, because you said weaponization ambitions.
Well, we have intelligence that they have everything they need to build a nuclear weapon, and that's more than enough.
Okay.
We should also talk about the US airstrike on Iran, since we now have photos of it. The images show there was a lot of damage and the blast radius was really large, even on the surface. However, they don't really tell us much about what happened underneath. According to Trump, then there was monumental damage below the ground level, and that the damage to the buildings was relatively low because, well, they were shielded from the flames. Every other source I've seen has said this was a really powerful strike. Credit to the US. They tricked the Iranians, flew around the world, and blew up their most secure bases without anyone even realizing. It is a marvel of military coordination and technology. However, it doesn't seem like it finished the job. If the Iranians evacuated their nuclear material, like they claim, which other sources appear to back up, then they still have the ability to make a nuclear weapon. The big question is whether or not they have more secret bases to finish enriching the uranium. If they do, then according to the US and Israel, they could have a nuke in a few weeks. If they don't, or the bases are too small, then this could delay them for years. It's still only a few years, though. The Iranian Atomic Energy Organization even came out and said this. Essentially, they already have the knowledge for a nuclear program. Destroying their facilities is just a setback, same as Stuxnet.
Can we be certain that all of Iran's enriched uranium was at those sites when the strikes hit?
We cannot. And unless or until there is independent verification of that, which there may never be, it's going to be difficult to know for certain. And he's not happy about it. He's already blaming reporters or media outlets for suggesting that it might not have been there. He insists it was. Remember, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was asked over the weekend by Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan whether or not the U.S. was certain it was all there. His response was, we don't see how they could have possibly moved it in time and where they would have moved it to, because Iran is under such heavy surveillance by the Israelis and the Americans that any attempt to move something out of those facilities would have been seen and possibly dealt with sooner. But again, absent independent verification of some sort, it's impossible to know whether all of it was destroyed.
On the other side of things, Trump has come out and said the uranium was definitely in there and that their nuclear program was completely destroyed. I hope he's right. He has way more information than I do. But if I was to be more cynical, I'm starting to think that the US has accepted that the Iranians will have a nuclear program. Realistically, the US has two options. One, let the Iranians complete their nuclear program, but try to delay it as much as possible, maybe until the next term. Or two, overthrow Iran's regime and prevent them ever having the political will to use their knowledge to create a nuclear weapon. If they go with the second option, there's also a chance that when the Iranian regime collapses, it shares its knowledge with other countries. Setting all of that aside, the US has said that regime change is not the goal of the war, and the ceasefire is evidence of that. Trump isn't planning to make Iran great again, despite his posts to the contrary. Oh yeah, what has the response been from the rest of the world? Well, since yesterday, the Islamic world has turned on Israel. By that I mean the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is composed of 57 countries, has condemned Israel. I have to admit, not terribly surprised. Water is wet, the sky is blue. Although, there was one comment which made me reconsider this. It was during Rubio's interview on Face the Nation. He said that lots of countries that had come out and condemned their decision might secretly support them. However, they can't say it publicly because of their domestic situations. That would apply to a lot of Arab countries whose leadership doesn't like Iran, but whose general population hates Israel. Anyway, it's sufficient to say the Islamic countries have a very complex position. So let's tackle the less complex ones. The UK, France, and Germany have released a joint statement supporting the US. I don't think it's quite as explicit as that, but they reiterate that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon and encouraged it not to respond against the US because it would destabilize the region. That's identical to the US's position. On the other side of things, China and Russia have come out supporting Iran and condemning the US. China called the attacks a violation of the UN Charter and international law and encouraged them to reach a ceasefire. I'm not sure it is a breach of international law, that's probably a topic for another video, but there's a good chance it is. Russia called the attacks on Iran's nuclear sites irresponsible and then said the same stuff as China. My understanding is that there were Russian people at one of those nuclear sites or in Iran working on them. That might be coloring their response. That and the Russians know a thing or two about nuclear disasters. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of the Russian Security Council, did say something extremely interesting though. According to him, several countries have offered to give Iran nuclear weapons after the US's strikes on them. I've heard some people say this is a veiled threat of Russian assistance, kinda like how they put nukes in Cuba, but it could just as easily be North Korea, which has already collaborated with Iran on military technology before. I don't see any reason to disbelieve what Dmitry is saying, though. Trump has also responded to Dmitry's comments, saying that he shouldn't be mentioning other countries giving Iran nuclear weapons so casually. So the US and Russia are calling each other reckless. India's response isn't that interesting on the surface. They've called for both parties to de-escalate and go back to diplomacy. However, they've got good relations with both Russia and the US, so they're probably going to be one of the countries to watch. The last response I want to talk about is Iran's. They've launched a retaliatory strike on the US airbase in Qatar. According to Trump, they've launched 14 missiles and 13 of them were knocked down and one missed entirely. No American lives were lost. The attacks were also widely condemned by countries throughout the region, including the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. On the diplomatic side of things, Iran's foreign minister conducted a press conference and they spoke at the United Nations Security Council. Both of these took place prior to their retaliation. In the conference, he condemned Israel. A lot. More so than the US, I think. He did condemn the US for the strikes, but it was before and after a condemnation of Israel, and at several points he claimed Israel was controlling the US. He also spoke about the damage to their nuclear facilities, which is important in international law. Your response should be proportionate to the damage suffered. I think his answer was very clever though. He said that it doesn't matter how much damage was suffered because attacking a nuclear facility is unforgivable. I think this harkens back to what the Russians were saying about it being reckless. Striking a nuclear power plant, whether or not it accomplished anything, justifies pretty much any response, because if something had gone wrong, there could have been a more serious nuclear disaster. And then, yeah, he capped off the press conference by saying it reserved all its options. This was prior to the retaliatory strike on the US, so we can assume that was the option they went with. Separately, the Iranian parliament also voted to shut down the Hormuz shipping channel, which controls 20% of the world's oil supply. That would have had a very negative effect on prices, and it prompted Trump to post and tell people not to let oil prices soar. I assume this threat has ended now that the ceasefire is going into effect, and the market has seemed to recover. The UN Security Council meeting wasn't too interesting, so I'm just going to give you the cliff notes. France and UK called for diplomacy, China condemned the US and made 4 appeals, the first being a ceasefire, the second being protection of civilians, third being a commitment to diplomacy, and the fourth being swift actions by the UNSC, which of course isn't going to happen. Russia said airstriking a nuclear facility could have unpredictable ecological consequences, and they said this was a repeat of 2003 when the US invaded Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. He also criticized the hypocrisy of Israel, refusing to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty while also claiming that it was attacking Iran to uphold it. And the US said it was acting in self-defense, and it cited Iran's calls for the destruction of the US as well as their killing of US soldiers and harm to Israel. This has been a very entertaining 48 hours. When I initially sort of drafted this video, well, it was before Iran's response, and before the ceasefire. So it was a much more up in the air. I still think it is. I think a lot of people are overeager, going, oh, well, everything's just resolved now. And it's like, not necessarily. There still needs to be a deal hammered out. Just because you've destroyed like a nuclear facility doesn't mean they can't rebuild it. And the extent of the damage isn't public yet. Also, well, yeah, if North Korea or some other country is going to give Iran nuclear weapons, I mean, that could just reignite this issue. Who knows? I think we'll probably still see a lot of activity on this topic for the next few weeks. I like to be optimistic, though. I think it's good to be optimistic. And hopefully this has all worked out.